Last week we talked about the very, very, very important sequence of going from historical literary context, step one. Step two is how we might interpret and apply it to today. That's called hermeneutics, technically speaking. The necessary steps from one to two. And I said a few times that the average Christian, understandably so, but they're usually taught this, frankly, that there's only one step, and that's step two. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to me? And so the Bible ends up being this timeless blueprint thing you look at like a mirror, and you just, whatever you like, you read it. You can do it that way. Historically, that leads to all kinds of things we call heresies. And so what scholars and what Christian thinkers have done for roughly 2,000 years is not that. What they say is, in general, I can spend a long time, and I won't, you're welcome, on how, in general, what they say is the best way to give us healthy, orthodox parameters to what Christians ought to believe is by locating the meaning within the historical literary context before we try to apply it to today. You think about this common sense for a second. Years ago, when Oprah was the queen of everything, unfortunately, I remember there was a big movement at the time of Deepak Chopra. What's the dude's name? Did The Secret? Him. He was on the show, and this other dude, there was like a white guy and a black guy, like an Asian guy. They were all different representations, and there's a black guy in a different kind of modern spiritualist uniform with big dreadlocks. They never did this on the Oprah show. My wife watched it pretty religiously. You need to pray for her. Doing that in Dateline, How to Kill Me. She has gone way off the tracks. I love you, Julia. After the show, they showed some video clips of what happened after the show stopped. So it was like post-show questions. And you have all these, 45-year-old white women, basically. And one of the questions was to the dude, how does this relate to Christianity? Because you could tell they were kind of stir-crazy a little bit, because a lot of people in the crowd, which I was a little surprised were Christians, at least by the reaction, you would say stuff and kind of go, you could tell it rubbed them the wrong way, because they were talking about this spiritualism and consciousness and da-da-da. So one of the first questions was, how does this relate to Christianity, what Jesus taught? And you see some ladies nodding like, I want him to answer this question. And he goes, oh, this is exactly what Jesus taught. This is exactly what he said. Jesus said the kingdom of God is in you. And what he meant was, and I was on the edge of my couch, that we all have a greater consciousness inside of us and we can tap in. I went, I would have paid a good amount of money to be in the crowd when he said that. To stand up and say, respectfully, everything he just said, and he went on for a while, is absolutely wrong. You don't have to believe me, but I do want you to believe the Gospels. Just read them, and you'll see everything he said was nonsense. Now, how do I know that? One is because I've actually read the Gospels in the original language, but two, historically I know no Jew would have ever thought of how their consciousness is and how that God isn't a divine being that's creating and sustaining the universe, but he's just this abstract consciousness idea. Nobody in the ancient world in Judaism would have thought that way. So, because of that historical context, I know for a fact what he said is gibberish. It's outside the bounds of that. Christians historically, their bounds they're kind of orthodox is firm, but there's a lot of different kind of flavors of Christians within the boundaries. The playground's pretty big, but there's a playground, but inside we disagree on different things, fine. But once you get outside the playground, you've left the playground. You've left altogether. And saying things like that means you've left it. That's like saying Jesus was a Chinese pregnant woman. No, he wasn't. You've misunderstood who he is, and so you've gone outside the bounds. You can say Jesus was a first century Jew who taught blank, and we might disagree on what he taught. Well, now we're in the playgrounds. That's just one of a billion examples of people who don't know what they're talking about, not because David thinks he's so arrogant. I'm not arrogant. I know how to read the text in historical context, and then, of course, literary context. And so that's why the first step is so important. One more time, it helps us not go way outside the bounds of nonsense. To nonsense. Nonsense meaning not orthodox is what I mean. I don't mean the people who believe it are stupid or worthless. No, just they're believing something the text never said. That's my only point. They might be fantastic, sweet, loving people, but their ideas are silly. Sometimes we just have silly ideas. Step two is how does it apply to me? So any questions or comments about that before we move on to today? Today's a pretty short, it can be, but anything about that you want to cover? Any questions or comments? Okay, on page 6, I said we'll get to this later on, and I skipped it very quickly, but I want to make sure I say this. And as you go on, we'll say this more and more. But in my whatever version of this workbook I did, eventually I put this in the early on because I was asked it so many times. On page 30 of their book of the second edition, it said a text cannot mean what it never meant. I think they've now adapted that to say a text cannot mean what it never meant to the original audience, something like that. But that's exactly right. So later on, if that's not what it meant, well, how can I apply it to today? That's step 2 in hermeneutics. And I give these basic principles. Now, these are mine. These are not novel. Good morning. These are the basic principles that most evangelical thinker Christians throughout the years would say this. Number 1, what did it mean to the ancient audience? That's called exegesis. If you don't know this, there's no limits, right? So first, what did it mean to them? 2, after we determine the ancient meaning or meanings, whenever we share the exact same life situation, we can directly apply a commandment or a principle or promise to us. We have to fit it exactly. Like Romans 3:23, most New Testament interpreters think all have sinned. He means in Romans 3, all Jews, all Gentiles have sinned. Both people groups. Of that, I am one. I am a Gentile. So therefore that applies to me. Paul believes I have sinned. Or for example, in Luke 14:33, when Jesus says, any one of you, now he means any of you in his first century Galilean ministry who are Jews. I'm not a Jew in the first century. But he does mean anyone who, it seems to me, wants to be his disciple. Do not renounce all that he has, cannot be my disciple. He literally says my disciple. I think that's still true today for anybody who wants to be his disciple. Like in Mark 8:34, he said, whoever wants to come after follow me, he must deny his will, pick up his cross, and follow me. Anyone, I think, means anyone, not just anyone who's a Jew, but any person who wants to be his disciple, which means these exact same life situations. Now, there's a whole lot in the Bible that doesn't fit my life situation. I'm a white, middle-aged male from America, and I didn't live back then. A lot of things just don't fit me. So that leads me to the number 3. If the life situation is not exactly the same, then look for a principle to apply in a similar life situation. Now, you want to test this principle with other teachings in the Bible to make sure you really have a principle. If you have a principle, then you're onto something. For example, in Mark chapter 10, a rich man comes up. He is not a rich young ruler. That's a conflation of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Mark is just rich. In Mark's gospel, a rich guy comes up and says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he says, why do you call me good? Only God is good. His way of saying he always deflects to the Father in his ministry. Then he says, the commandments, which one have you done? Oh, I follow the commandments, blah, blah, blah. And he says, good. You got one last thing. And Mark says, he looked upon him and loved him and said, go sell everything you have and give to the poor and come follow me. And the man says, high five. No, right, he doesn't. He goes away forlorn. He's sad because he had many, many possessions. So when Jesus tells this guy, go sell everything you have and give to the poor, do I fit that life situation? Well, according to the global wealth, I'm rich. In global wealth, I am a wealthy person because I'm making the top, 5% of some of the world's population in money. According to America, I'm not rich, but in the world, I am. So if you use the global system, I fit the rich man's situation. However, when we look for, and it's, okay, well, that case, do I need to sell everything I have and give to the poor and follow Jesus? Maybe. But I think not, because I think in this situation, in his particular culture, he wasn't known by the globe, but his particular culture, that person was considered rich. And 2, we know of other rich people in Jesus' ministry who did not sell everything they have and give to the poor to follow him. They had money to support other people, like women. In Luke chapter 8, verses 1-3, it says certain wealthy women supported Jesus and his disciples financially. Judas himself carried the money bag, the money purse, John's gospel says, for the disciples. So I have numerous examples. If Jesus were so anti-money, why did he allow it to be collected, to use for buying food? Why not just pop bread into existence, fish to exist? He was not anti-money. Jesus wasn't a mendicant. He wasn't a beggar. He was an anti-money. So I see the principle in general. What we see is Jesus thinks that whenever anything gets in the way of devotion to him, it's got to go. Anything at all. So whether it's money, whether it's family ties, whatever. So principle becomes, that applies to me very much. You say, David, you're just trying to getting rid of your stuff. Maybe. I don't think I am. I think I'm applying the text correctly. So I don't think I fit the exact same situation as that rich man. But the principle is, if anything gets in the way of your obedience to Jesus, it's got to go. And that is, I think, very much true. And then number 4, of course, like I said, whatever the principle is, it's got to be something he would command or do. If you think, I think the principle of this is people should just go buy a Corvette whenever they want it. I think the principle is it's good to sleep around. I think the principle is, if anything your principle is doesn't fit the major teachings of Jesus, you're mistaken. And I've added some other ones since then, like step 5 would be, if you're still unsure, what did the early church say? Did the early church agree with your view or not? Anyway. So those are kind of the steps we go through. And you might not notice this, but when I teach the Bible, preach on a Sunday morning, I do the exact same thing all the time. So throughout the week, as I'm studying the text as carefully as I can, I do that as carefully as I can. And then step 2 is always, now how do I help people in Kewanee, Illinois, and the surrounding areas, and y'all in this room, how do I help you apply that ancient meaning to today? And the easiest thing to do, which almost every single person does when they teach, is ignore step 1. Just treat everything that happens as a universalized principle, and it all becomes an allegory. And that's what I will refuse to do. And that's what makes my job much more difficult, because I'm always sorting through who in this room would fit that exact situation. If you do, then this applies directly to you. If not, what's the principle applied to us? I'll do that today when I do the James chapter 3. I will do it constantly. Some things apply perfectly. Some things more principle. Some are perfect, some principle. I'm not assuming I'm right in that. I'm just saying that is my effort. That is my goal. That is absolutely my goal, because I want to understand what they said back then. I'm going to move on to page 9 now. Anything about that you want to talk about? So if you're unsure about maybe historical literary context, it's okay to try to ask, how does it apply to me? I agree. I do agree. I do not think it's sinful or evil to say, can I at least ask, what might this text say to me in my situation? I don't think that's sinful to do that at all. I think at minimum Christians ought to do that, because I think the text is authoritative. 2, I think the Spirit will work to that situation. The problem with that, like I said, is that there are no parameters to help us not think that the Spirit told me is just my gut, my intuition, my upbringing, my woundedness, my spouse, my own preference. And so the historical lyric context, in my view, keeps us rooted. So it doesn't mean if you don't ask step 1, you're automatically wrong. I don't think that's true. I've met baby Christians who read a text and go, that's a really good insight of how it might apply, right? But the other times, usually it's not. I think it means, no, that's not what I meant. Another quick thing about that, and I say that I'm slowly working for hundreds of hours on this discipleship workbook on the side, and hopefully we make it see the light of day. But one thing that's saying that very, very clearly is that Bible scholars do not tell you how to apply it to your life. That's not their goal. That's not my training. My training is to tell you how to apply it. It's what did it mean back then? They're trying to kind of clear away nonsense and like archaeological dig. But how you apply it to your life, in my view, is that's between you and the Spirit, and hopefully a Christian community and so forth. So one more time, yes, if you don't know the historical context, don't freak out and panic. I can never read the Bible. Throw my hands up in despair. No. Go to the text devotionally. Read over it slowly. Read the best translations you can get your hand on. The Bible apps are free. Reread it over and over and over. Ask the Spirit to speak to you. How might I apply this today? Does this relate to me today? Do the best job you can. And if you're really at it, then go talk to a mature Christian, and say, hey, I think maybe God said this to me. And so maybe it's a sign of laziness. Yeah. Well, sure, it's convenient to skip that step. Yeah. It is. I mean, it's just, I don't care about all that junk. I mean, yeah, it's easy to do that. But it's your choice. I mean, yeah, all of our choices. Good question, good point. So yes, you don't have to be a Bible scholar to use the Bible. Nope. But it'll help you with historical context. This week, today, this morning is a bit, you're going to maybe don't know why this matters, but it does matter. But we're going to jump into the genres, the rest of the study. This matters because obviously you're going to know how to read the Bible and which translation do I use, unless you're reading Hebrew or Greek. So this, you may have never been taught before, but the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, has a little bit of Aramaic, particularly in Daniel, and the New, because that's late in the New Old Testament. The chapter 7 to 12 was very late in Daniel chapter 7 to 12. So that's almost 99.9% Hebrew, and the New Testament is 99.99% in Greek. There's a little bit of Latin, or at least some Latinisms and some Aramaisms. But so in general, Old Testament's Hebrew, New Testament's Greek. It was not written in English. It didn't exist in English. Didn't exist in any ancient language besides what it was written in. And then it got quickly translated to Syriac, Latin, Coptic, on, and even Arabic later. So a translation is an interpretation. It just is. It's the way translations are. This is not some liberal, progressive thing to say. If you speak Espanol, as soon as you start speaking a different language, you go, how do I convey this idea to that person in front of me? And that changes over time. It's just, that's it. So if you can't read the originals, try your best to do different translations. And you can pick one to memorize, that's cool. But when you study it, you want to go to different translations. You just do, if you don't know the original. So for example, let's say 1 Corinthians 7:36. The New King James Version says, if any man thinks that he is behaving improperly toward his virgin. The New American Standard Bible says, if any man thinks that he's behaving unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter. The New NIV says, if anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to. The New English Bible says, if a man has a partner in celibacy and feels that he is not behaving properly towards her, well, there you go. They have different ways of reading. If you don't know the Greek, I know Julia's face. You see, my Bible says, well, and that's good, but it's just one translation. If you don't know the Greek and you can't nuance the Greek, well, then you're going to say, you need to look at different ones to see what they're gist. I say, based on the literary context of 1 Corinthians 7 concerning marriage and divorce, the best translation in this list is the New NIV. You might say fiancé. The New Revised Standard calls it fiancé. Again, let the literary context and a good Bible commentary help you. In the ancient world, they didn't call it a fiancé. They didn't have the word fiancé. We know in American English we use fiancé as someone to whom I am engaged. They didn't have a word for that. The best they would have as a translation is betrothed, but they didn't say fiancé. And so in your English translation of Matthew chapter 2, and remember that in Joseph, he's to his, sometimes it says betrothed. But if I'm just telling a person right now, I'm reading from the Greek, I'm not going to say betrothed. No one uses betrothal in American English. Nobody does. I would say that's his fiancé. We go, okay. The problem with that is this. My fiancé, I don't have any legal obligation to my fiancé. I've promised to marry the person, and typically the promise is manifested by a ring I give to the person. In the ancient world, it wasn't like that. A betrothed had a more legal ramifications. You had to legally dissolve the betrothment before. You can't just say, throw my ring out in the ocean, forget you, and it's over, and then no one knows about it. No, betrothal is much more a public process. We go through a legal, you might have to go to a lawyer, or someone has to dissolve the legal contract. There's a contract they signed. So fiancé doesn't work just right, but betrothal is a word we don't use much. So there's an example in a modern, so I'm interpreting this translation. What's the word? I can tell you the word, but I need to unpack it for you. It's fiancé plus. It's something we don't have today in American culture. We don't. Engagement just means I'm going to marry you at a certain date. That's not what they did. But does that help you make sense of that's the kind of stuff? I think that was a nod. It's bright in here. Or my goal is to make you completely doubt your reading of the Bible. Is that working, Marcus? That's not my goal. My only point is, if you're going to study the text, you need to study by different translations. That's the goal. If you don't have a workbook, there's one right back there on the table, a little spiral notebook. So that's the goal, is to get into a little footnote. I had a professor who go, let me drop a footnote. His name is Wayne Stacy. He did it all the time in class. Let me drop a footnote and say, I appreciate and respect the fact that we do the best job we can most of the time. I get that. And most Bible teachers, preachers do not have training in this. They don't get biblical languages. They usually abhor them. They're not required to take them. And I've heard copious sermons, bad ones, because they didn't know what the word meant. Or they use the Message, which I'll talk about, it's just a paraphrase. They'll say, I like that word, therefore it meant. And it's just, no, that's not at all. And so there's whole long discourses on this issue. It just was false. So it's good for yourself. You can listen to us, I hope you do, and then go, is that what the text said? How do you know that's what it said? So now we're just blind lemmings, if that makes sense. And when you ask Bible teachers, hey, can you say more about that? That's not arguing with them. That's not being a punk. It's just, where does that word come from? Can you say, I like learning. Most people like to have those conversations, but if they don't, if you ever go to a Bible teacher and they go, well, it's what I said, they're okay, never mind. But it's okay to ask, where'd that come from? Hey, my translation's different than what you preached on. Why do you think that is? What is the Greek word or Hebrew? They don't know. Oh, let's look it up together. I don't know. That's okay to do. None of us are omniscient. My goodness. Is there a translation closest to the Greek? Absolutely not King James. Yeah. So I'm going to answer that question later on. If a very good question, the answer is yes. The short of the story is NET is my favorite, the New English translation. NET is my favorite, but I'll tell you in a second why. Translators are faced with two chief questions. That's in any language, whether Hebrew, Greek, Spanish, Espanol, doesn't matter. What are the exact words of the original text? How should we translate those ideas into our own? The first is called textual criticism. It's the science of how the words came to be. What is the most ancient words on the papyrus? And then how do we translate them? Those are two different things. And you can learn about it yourself if you want. And I put in one paragraph the best I could do. We do not possess the original manuscripts of the Bible. Manuscript comes from Latin word, of course, manuscripti, which means handwritten. A manuscript is anything that's handwritten. And for around 1,200 years in the New Testament, everything was handwritten. It went to the printing press, the movable type press of Gutenberg. Do you remember Gutenberg in your German history? Of course you do. That's a nerd joke, thank you. Gutenberg's movable press was the first time people could stamp out the same page over and over and over and over and over and over and over. Before then, everything was handwritten. That's a manuscript. Well, we don't have the original ones. We do not have any original. We don't know when Paul or his amanuensis, Tertius, who wrote Romans, when the ink dried, we don't have that one. Or to the Corinthians or Mark, we don't have the originals. What we possess are copies of copies of copies. There are over 5,800 handwritten scraps or whole documents, manuscripts of the New Testament copied by scribes from the 1st century to the 15th century, around 5,800. And we found them in caves and all those things. And of course, you can imagine this. The older they are, like they're written in the year 1000 and then 800 AD, 700, those are complete texts. We have whole copies of the New Testament. The older you get, the closer to the originals, the more fragmentary it gets because they're ancient and they fell apart, papyrus and so forth. So by the time we get to the second century, early 100s, then we've got around 18 Greek manuscripts fragmentary. Generally considered the most ancient or one of the most ancient manuscript fragments we have is from the Gospel of John. And I have that, I'll show you in a second what that is. So manuscripts, a handwritten document. Because they were handwritten, there were numerous scribal errors. We call these variants in textual criticism. The variants, 99.5 to 99.8% of the variants are easily spotted. They're basic, simple grammatical mistakes, and all modern translations get rid of them. So you don't have to be scared of them. If you are a teacher, you've been a teacher in this room ever, and I know you're going to say amen. The second you see a student write anything handwritten, there's going to be spelling errors and grammatical just to your nosebleeds. That's just the way it is. Well, ancient scribes weren't that different when they were copying because they were copying by hand, looking left, right. And there's numerous common mistakes. Textual critics even have words for that. Didographies, but they have words for the common mistakes they made. And then it got to where a person would stand up here like this, and in a room called a scriptorium, a place where you write, scripta, right? People like you would sit there with papyrus in your hand, and I would read it aloud. We do not possess, and you write out, we do not possess. But what about words that were homily, that you sounded like, if I said our, but you thought I said are, A-R-E, or words that were like there versus there versus there, right? 3 different theirs, right? The possessive and so forth. Well, depending on which one you write down is a variant. It's an error. It's a change of what I said. But you can spot those easily if you read English and you go, oh, that's what they meant. They just used the wrong word. Right? If you know your English, you spot it easily in English. People who know Greek well spot it easily in Greek. They go, oh, that's just a mistake. So modern translations just clean all that up and get rid of it. They go, oh, they just didn't mean that. So a textual critic goes through all those things and puts all the parts together. So a translation is like a patchwork quilt of hundreds of different parts of various manuscripts, presenting in large part the original wording of the Bible. So that's what it is. If your Bible was full of colored red, green, purple, blah, blah, of the different manuscripts, it would look like a rainbow. I mean, Skittles, worse, but more than that. Because this ancient so if you turn on the page, you'll see some pictures I put in there of, these are actual manuscripts that you can go to at Oxford, Cambridge, maybe Princeton. A lot of them are in Europe. They get everything. Codex Sinaiticus, because codex is the technical word for what you call a book. A codex is when you have pages side by side and you write on the front and back and you glue or you sew the bottom. It's what you call a book. So technically in scholarship, that's called a codex, not a book, a codex. And so a Codex Sinaiticus, it means this codex was found on Mount Sinai. It was in a monastery on Mount Sinai, so we called it Codex Sinaiticus. Around 325 AD, it's one of the most valuable and exquisite manuscripts in existence. A large part of what you call the New Testament, the translators use Codex Sinaiticus for it, large chunks of it. It's the best full copy we have. There's another thing called Codex Vaticanus, which is in the Vatican. It's also very, very, very valuable. Those two together, those are big, big dogs. They're whole collections, whole manuscripts. P52 is maybe the oldest in the Rylands Library Papyrus. P, lowercase, means papyrus. 52 means it was the 52nd papyrus cataloged. It's the oldest fragment, at least when I wrote this. There might be a couple that tie it, but the oldest, maybe a fragment of the New Testament. That Mark thing is probably false. When I wrote this, that was true, but they've since outdated the Mark piece. This piece is dated, the P52, around 120 AD. It's about as big as a credit card. On the front and back has John 18. So that's it. That's the oldest. It'd be cool to have the rest of it. We have the rest of it later. We just don't have it on that document. Most scribes in the ancient world all the time, they use the thing called a tablet. I can't remember the Latin word for it, but it's a wax tablet. It's what children learn how to write on. It's a wax tablet, and they would write it with their stylus and then heat it up and smooth it out again, then a wax tablet and smooth it out. It's an ancient iPad. And you'd write it on that first, and then you would write it on the papyrus when you got the exact wordage, the exact spelling, the way you wanted. And so most likely all the documents in the New Testament, Gospels, letters, everything, were first composed on a wax tablet, and then the scribe put it on papyrus. It reminds me always when I see in World War I, World War II, when the soldiers are writing, "Dear Annie Mae, I think of you every day." And they write all this out in scribbles, and then that's a ball of junk, and they rewrite it again when it's all pretty and cursive. Right, the first draft was what they wanted to say. Papyrus, if you know, it's from the papyrus plant. It came from Egypt. Papyrus plant grows near shallow water. When you rip it apart, the leaves, they rip them down basically, and then you do like long strips this way, and then you flip like a crisscross. So you get them real wet, lay them on something flat. They used to use real flat rocks, lay it flat, and then crisscross, and then do it again. It's all soaking wet. They would smash it with rocks, get real hot, take the rock off, and you have a piece of papyrus. Of course, our word paper comes from papyrus. If they were taken care of, that papyrus, it was really done well and taken care of, it could last for 2 centuries. But if not taken care of, it brittled and fall away. Depends on how the conditions. But the goal is you write the papyrus and then you roll it up, and that became, of course, the scroll. The word biblos is the word scroll. Biblia means scrolls. That's where you get the word Bible. Literally means scrolls. Biblia means scrolls. It's plural. And that's how everyone talked in the ancient world, except for this small group of function in the Roman world where the only time you ever really saw a codex form in ancient Roman world, and that was when you went to school. If you ever were trained and went to school, they preferred the codex form. And for some unknown reason, the Christians immediately adopted the codex form as the way to do it. They originally had scrolls. Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, the gospel, the letters would have been scrolls passed to churches. But early on, the early Christians said, let's put all these scrolls together in a codex. And they did that. Well, the Romans kept using scrolls for centuries, but the Christians liked to use the codex, and so put all the scrolls together. And to this day, we still have our Bible all shoved together in a codex. Christians didn't invent it, but we made it popular. There's no conspiracy theory. Most modern translations have footnotes. If you think there's something, they'll usually have brackets or a footnote that says this is not in the ancient manuscripts or this is unsure. And here's some examples of the biggies. Bart Ehrman, who's now an atheist, who was a Christian, goes on and on and on and on about that. And textual criticism, it's a joke. We study all this stuff. No one's shocked anymore. It's surprising the first time you hear it. But, for example, Mark 1:1, we don't have too much time now, but you can look up in your own Bible translation. Mark 1:1, if you have a good study Bible, there's going to be a little asterisk or a footnote when it says, Mark 1:1 says this, it says this in Greek, beginning, you can say the beginning, but it really is beginning gospel of Jesus Christ. And then brackets is the Son of God. I did a whole paper on my piece, New Testament on textual criticism, a 50-page paper on the Son of God original. And my whole big therefore was, probably not, who cares? And the professor said, then why'd you do? What difference? I said, none of this matters. And the Gospel of Mark, we all know he's called Son of God other places. It's irrelevant. He's called that in 1:1. But anyway, but it's missing in some of the really respected manuscripts. So did Mark originally have Jesus Christ, or did he originally have Jesus Christ, Son of God? That's called a textual variant. We're not sure. Most of your translations have Son of God in it. And there's some person or a committee, usually a committee, who's going over the translation and all these ancient words and goes, should we put it in the translation that Bonnie's going to buy? And they'd vote on it. They vote on it, and then they decide, let's put it in there. But what they do is they often put a footnote that says, but some ancient manuscripts don't have this, like wink, wink. If they're really unsure, or they know it shouldn't be in there, they're going to put it in brackets, like the ending of Mark. There's a shorter ending of Mark in chapter 16, verse 8, and that verse says, and the women fled from the tomb, saying nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Dunk, dunk, that's it. Early scribes didn't like that, so they added alternate endings. In fact, 2 different endings. It's in the alternate ending of 9 through 20. That's in verse 18. It says, and if the Christians get bit by snakes, serpents, they will not be stung. Or if they handle snakes, they won't. So, like in West Virginia, they call them the snake handlers. Have you ever seen those before? I saw a documentary of this person. This old dude, is like in his 80s. And he goes, I've been bit 18 times. And he's like, we're proud. Like, wait, that means you're a sinner. I mean, that means you don't have faith. Why would you be bragging? You should be like holding your arms. Never been bit. That is no scholar thinks that's original. Nobody thinks Mark's original gospel had that ending. None of them. So your translation probably, it might have it, but it probably has it in brackets with a footnote that says ancient manuscripts don't have this. But eventually scribes didn't like that ending. Scholars divided where he really ended Mark's gospel. I have a theory on that. We don't have time to talk about that. Another favorite, this is what upsets people, and this one. John 7:53 to 8:11. The woman caught in adultery. There's no way that was in John's gospel. That was a floating story. Some manuscripts have that in Luke. Some manuscripts have that in different parts of John. In fact, if you take that out of John 7:53 to 8:11, if you take it out, just extirpate it, and read it, John 7 through 52, and pick up 8 verse 12, it's smooth as can be. For some reason, it landed there. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. I didn't say it didn't happen. I said almost certainly it's not original to John. For some reason, it was this floating story. So that's why I've never preached on it in my life, because I don't think it happened. But it might have. And if I did teach on it, I would say, we're not sure if this happened, but it did make it eventually. But boy, have I heard thousands of sermons on it. Okay, I keep going. So the problem is, this doesn't happen. There's not thousands of these. There's about 10 to 12 things like this that we're on the fence about. None of them affect theology. None of them affect doctrine. None of them say, one textual variant says Jesus never existed. One says the Trinity is a load of junk. I mean, nothing remotely close to that. Nothing close to that. So you'll have a footnote that tells you if you have any questions about that, if you're ever in doubt, I'm happy to help you make it more confusing. Let me know. Most of the time, the King James Version and the New King James is just inferior. It's just worse. Why is that? Because I hate King James? No. Because when King Jimmy was first written in 1611, they had about 6 or 7 manuscripts to use. We have 5,800. We just know more about Greek. We know about the Bible. We know more about the manuscripts than they had any access to. We just know more. It's not against them. Every single modern translation is going to be better. Every modern translation is going to be better because they use manuscripts that have been, like Indiana Jones, who keeps discovering manuscripts. Well, they keep discovering them, portions of them, and they go, well, that helps us understand this text a little better. Let's change that one word. That's happened over the centuries. The New English translation that I like so much, it keeps those updated. And they're mostly in what we call the general epistles, Jude, 1st, 2nd Peter, and so Hebrews. Every once in a while they'll say, based on this discovery in 1964, we think this is the best reading now. And it kind of keeps it updated. There's not many, there's a couple. But the old translation, the King James Version, it sure is pretty. It's pretty. But that's it. The KJV gets so many translations wrong, like mansions. John 14:2, in my Father's house there are many mansions. That is not at all what the Greek is. That is not what the Greek is. Moni means rooms or dwelling places. That's all it means. The Greek is very clear. It is not. They didn't have a thing called a mansion. They didn't have a word for it. Mansion, mansion comes from the French. And so they didn't have the word. And so you still have that song. I love it. I heard about a mansion they built for me in glory. I grew up on the song too. It's just false. It's just completely. I love victory in Jesus. It's just not what the Bible said. Jesus never said that. He said there are many rooms. The point is there's plenty of space where I'm going to prepare for you. You're going to have a place to live with me. but that's all. Things like that happen. Does that mean you go to hell if you think there's a mansion? No. Does it mean, you should never listen to a Bible teacher, preacher if they use a word? No. Right, hopefully we're going to give people grace. We can't know everything and know all translations. I make mistakes. My goodness. It's just this kind of stuff is I'm trying to give there are results, the consequences of this. Then when it comes to translations, any question about that before we go on? Anything about the textual criticism, how the words, any comments or questions about that? So what were some of the things that made papyrus break apart over time? Good. At least a few things. One is they were burned. So certain Romans at a certain point whenever they found manuscripts that were the Christians, that they would actually destroy them. That's one thing. The other thing, of course, is usage. So when scrolls got rolled up, the beginnings and the ends got the most damaged because they were being wrinkled over time. That is one of the leading theories of what happened to Mark's gospel, that the end of the gospel got ripped off because it was used so much and we lost it. The earliest original manuscript. I find that quite persuasive. We can't just go find it. It's dissolved in the earth and now part of a fly somewhere. Well, that died centuries ago. The other reason is weather. Weather, really. The more humid it is, the worse it lives. It needs to be dry, dry, dry. The drier, the better. So that's why the papyrus manuscripts that we found, the Dead Sea Scrolls in Egypt, that's why they survived, because they were in arid territory. The farther north and east they went, toward Europe, it got milder climates. They don't last nearly as long. Tertullian, an early church father, he's talking about these pretend people who are criticizing Christianity in the Bible, and he says, if you want to know what they really wrote, go to the original apostles. Go to where Paul wrote his letter that are still in the churches this day. And he wrote that in the early 3rd century. So if he's not, I don't think he's lying, if he's correct, that means it is possible that Paul, some of the original Corinthian correspondence was at the Corinthian church 100 years later, 150 years later, which means when they wrote copies, they would have almost certainly gone back to the original to write a copy from it. So I think we have reason to trust it. Doesn't mean there weren't spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes, but I think a lot of them lasted for a long time. And then eventually, when you have a really, really good copy, why keep the first one? See, we love that. I'm like, keep it. This is gold. That's an American, right? So if we value New England and we want to go Paul Revere or whatever, you renovate it to look like the original. They didn't in the ancient world. They didn't care at all about that. To commemorate it, you destroyed it and built a temple on top. Isn't this a sacred spot? High five, we did it. Why did you? So we have to dig underneath all the crap they did. They didn't think that way. And so if I got a really good copy, I don't need this anymore. It's broken apart. It reminds me of a little footnote of how we do this in modern world. I can't remember his name, guy. He's one of the dudes on this is way before you were thought of. The original, it's called the Dream Team. And this is when the American had the Olympic, Michael Jordan, and he is. So they go to the Olympics and they cream everybody, but people were so excited to see them play because the Americans had never used professional sports. Well, they just beat everybody by 1,000 points. And it was so fun. They were the dream, all the biggies. Well, when they finished the tournament, their uniforms, this is history in sports, American history. The globe, then there's Jesus, and number 2 is the Dream Team. So what they did was a guy took uniform, just throw it on the ground because they're going to change, take a shower, take a change. So one of the guys who played on the team, his wife thought, I'm going to keep these things. So she went and collected all these sweaty old uniforms and their shoes and had him sign it. And in his house, in these glass guards, he had them all standing up, all perfect, like they're just mummies. The stained sweat and everything. And he wanted to sell them on auction. I don't know what he's going to make, $100 million. But see, we want to keep it to sustain it. I'm saying that's a modern idea that we want it to be original. What's the word I'm looking for in cars? When you go back to the restore, right? You restore it. I wish we had him too. This morning you asked, but I'm kidding. He's not second beneath Jesus. Maybe 3 or 4, but he's not second. Art of translation, it is an art. So then the question is, back to your question, is which one is the best or closest? Translators of any language are on those 2 extremes. Are we trying to be word for word, quote unquote literal, or idea for idea? And all translators, whether you're speaking, again, Espanol on the street with a person, you're always thinking that. What do I do in this exact moment? And so, and if you go word for word basic, that's called formal equivalence. Functional equivalence is idea for idea, depends. So for example, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly just to prime the pump here. Should lamp be translated flashlight or torch? in cultures where they no longer use oil lamps. We don't hardly use oil lamps. We did 50 years ago. My mom and grandmother, we had oil lamp. You remember those lamps? You'd at the bottom, you twist the lamp. Well, we don't use it much anymore, hardly at all. So in the Bible, when it says literally lamp, when the virgins have their lamps waiting for the bridegroom, or should I get a flashlight or torch? Do I say lamp and assume you know what it means? Should I say holy kiss, which is all over the place in the New Testament? You should greet each other with a holy kiss. And I bet none of you have kissed one person yet this morning. I bet none of you have. Don't believe in the Bible. Should we translate that the handshake of Christian love? Jennifer said, yes, don't kiss me. Katie said, I would literally crawl under the chair. I'm going to go on some other ones. What about money? Like in Matthew 15, talenton was a Greek currency amount of a very large size. When Jesus says, don't use your talents well. But he's not talking about money. Should we keep the word talent, even though today we mean talent means trait or skill? Do you want to keep the word? What about euphemisms? Genesis, the manner of women is upon me. Or should we say, I'm having my monthly period? Should you say he raped her or he forced her and lay with her? What about gender inclusiveness? That became a big deal 25 years ago. Should we say men and women or when it says men? And some said when they added women, that's not what the Bible said. Some people got really upset when they added and women. So when I teach for the Bible, I'll say, and it doesn't say in women, but it means that. Or I'll say brethren and sisterin. My flesh. So at the top of the page, the next page, you'll see formal equivalents on the far side, KJV, NA, the New American Standard Bible, all those. The more you get to the right, the more you get more idea. On the far, far right, the apple that fell off the tree is called a paraphrase. The New Living Bible and the Message are paraphrases. Those are loose paraphrases. So when you study, I like to stay more toward the middle. So I prefer the New Revised Standard Version, the New NIV, ESV, NET. NET is probably my favorite. NRSV is my second favorite. I think NET is a great sweet spot between it's very informed by textual criticism and scholarship, but it's made for modern English speakers. It uses conversational style, but not at a 4th grade level, but maybe like a 10th or 11th grade level. So that's my favorite. So when I put text on the screen ever, I'm always using NET for that reason. I like it. When I study, I try to do the original languages by the time I get it to other people. And so, but my Greek English Bible, I use the Greek and English during when I teach. It's Greek on one side, and it's the Revised Standard Version, the RSV. That's an old one. So that's why sometimes even the RSV, when I'm reading from English, I will still translate it to you. For example, a lot of people don't use the word licentiousness. Well, RSV did, but we don't use that anymore. NET won't say it that way. They'll say living like Kathy. It's a very different meaning. I'm kidding. I'll make sure she's listening. Nearly all modern translations are better than the old ones. Why? We know more. Language change over time. That's normal. It's just normal. Before I was born, gay meant happy. Not anymore. So if I have a Bible translation, I'm going to say he's gay. It changes the whole meaning for a modern culture. There's no bad translations. There aren't. There are no bad translations. Not horrible ones. They're just ones that are more accurate to the original and better at communicating ideas. Don't be scared of them. Use different translations if you can. Pick up 2 or 3. Again, Bible apps they're free, so just go through 3 or 4 of them. When in doubt, give up. I'm kidding. When in doubt, ask questions and just keep digging. Don't give up. Don't give up. Okay, next week we're going to start a whole lot of genre stuff. This is just to help you about the Bible. We're going to go into narrative, how to read a narrative, how to read prophecy, how to read a psalm. We're going to go through all that. Quick prayer. Thank you, Lord Jesus, so much for the chance to think about the text you gave to us. Please help us not be discouraged, not give up. Read it and apply it. Thank you, Jesus, for everything you've done for us and trusting us to be able to comprehend this. And thank you for specialists who can help us understand it better. In Jesus' name, amen.